April 11, 1945. 32,000 feet above Magdeburg, Germany. Oberleutnant Ernst Weber's hands trembled inside his leather gloves, though not from the 40 below zero cold seeping through his Focke-Wulf 190's damaged heating system. Leading the last 7 operational fighters of Jägerschwader 3, once the Luftwaffe's most decorated unit, he scanned the empty fuel gauge with the numb acceptance of a man who'd watched his entire world disintegrate one mission at a time. The radio crackled. Wolf Pack leader, massive bomber formation approaching from the west. Altitude Angels 25. At least 400 heavies. Weber's wingman, a 19-year-old boy named Klaus who'd logged barely 30 hours in type before being thrown into combat, was asking the question Weber knew was coming. Herr Oberleutnant, where are their escorts? Weber looked at the crystalline sky stretching endlessly in all directions. His answer carried the weight of 3 years of transformation from hunter to hunted. Everywhere, Klaus. They're everywhere. And they always have fuel we'll never see again. 3 years earlier, Ernst Weber had been a rising star in the Luftwaffe's elite fighter force, credited with 18 victories over the Eastern Front before transferring to home defense in December 1943. JG-3 Udet, named after the legendary First World War ace Ernst Udet, represented the aristocracy of German fighter aviation. Their pilots were hand-picked, their aircraft maintained to perfection, their mission sacred: defend the Reich's industrial heart from the growing avalanche of American daylight bombing. Weber arrived at JG-3's base at Salzwedel in early January 1944 with confidence built on skill, training, and an unshakable belief in German tactical and technological superiority. The Americans, he'd been assured by commanders who seemed certain, could not escort their bombers beyond the Ruhr. Their P-47 Thunderbolts were short-legged, their P-38 Lightnings unreliable at high altitude. German fighters could position themselves beyond escort range and methodically destroy bomber formations at leisure. The mathematics seemed irrefutable. But mathematics, Weber would learn, meant nothing when the fundamental assumptions were wrong. His first mission over Germany came on January 29, 1944. A massive American raid targeting Frankfurt. Weber and his staffel formed up at 27,000 feet, positioning for their attack run as the bomber stream approached. The P-47 escorts, as predicted, had begun their fuel-limited turn back toward England. The bombers were naked, vulnerable. Weber armed his weapons, steadied his breathing, prepared for the dive that would carry his FW-190 through the formation like an arrow through silk. Then the warning came. Achtung, single-engine fighters, 11 o'clock high. Weber's first thought was friendly fire identification error. German controllers sometimes mistook their own aircraft. But as he looked up and west, his blood stopped. 6 sleek aircraft were diving on his formation from 30,000 feet. Not the stubby, thick-bodied Thunderbolts. Not the distinctive twin-boomed Lightnings. Something new. Something that shouldn't exist here, 200 miles inside German airspace. The Americans called them Mustangs. And in the 30 seconds before Weber's entire concept of the air war shattered, he recognized them by their distinctive laminar flow wings and the confident, aggressive attack profile of pilots who knew they had fuel to burn and altitude to spare. What followed taught Weber the first bitter lesson of many to come. These new American fighters were not just present where they shouldn't be. They were superior where it mattered. His wingman died in the first pass, canopy exploding in a shower of shattered glass and blood. Weber snap-rolled, dove, twisted through every evasive maneuver his 800 hours of flight time had taught him. The Mustang followed easily. Only a desperate split-S at 15,000 feet, screaming down through his own bomber formation with the American fighter momentarily forced to break off, saved Weber's life. He landed at Salzwedel with his fuel tanks nearly empty, his aircraft stitched with 50 caliber holes, and his worldview in smoking ruins. The impossible had become routine. That night, Weber wrote in his journal, "They told us the Americans couldn't reach here. They were wrong. They told us our aircraft were superior. They're not. They told us we were defending a fortress. But there are no walls, only sky, and the sky belongs to them now. The commanders insisted the January encounters were aberrations, advanced scouts with experimental range extenders. The main American fighter force, they promised, remained short-ranged. JG-3 would continue intercepting bombers in the safe zones beyond escort coverage. Weber wanted to believe it. His survival depended on those safe zones existing. But with each passing week, the safe zones shrank. By February, Mustangs appeared regularly over Brunswick, Hanover, Magdeburg. By March, they escorted all the way to Berlin. By April, there was nowhere in Germany beyond their reach. The Mustang was not simply a fighter. It was a strategic revolution wrapped in aluminum and powered by a British-designed, American-built Packard Merlin engine that produced more power at 30,000 feet than anything in the German arsenal. Its combat radius exceeded 650 miles when fitted with disposable drop tanks. It could fly to Berlin, fight for 30 minutes, and return to England. German engineers had declared such performance physically impossible. Reality disagreed. Weber watched his squadron disintegrate through the winter and spring of 1944. Hauptmann George Schneider, his commander, a veteran with 41 victories, died over Berlin on March 6. His replacement lasted 3 weeks. Lieutenant Franz Koch, Weber's closest friend, 23 years old with a wife and infant daughter, was shot down over Kassel on April 19. His parachute never opened. Unteroffizier Martin Bauer, the young pilot Weber had personally trained, survived 4 missions before encountering P-51s over Magdeburg. His aircraft exploded so completely that no wreckage larger than a seat cushion was ever found. By summer 1944, Weber commanded what remained of 2nd Staffel. He was 26 years old and felt 50. The eager young pilots arriving as replacements looked like children because they were 17 and 18-year-olds with 80 hours total flight time being asked to dogfight against American pilots with 400 hours and combat experience in their logbooks. Weber tried to teach them survival. Don't chase damaged bombers into formations. Don't engage escorts if you can avoid it. Never, ever get into a turning fight with a Mustang because it will outturn, outclimb, and outgun you while its wingman sets up for the kill. Most didn't live long enough to apply the lessons. The American fighter pilots were not superhuman. Weber had observed them closely enough in combat to recognize they made mistakes, showed varying skill levels, occasionally broke formation or misjudged angles. But they had what German pilots increasingly lacked: numbers, fuel, training, and the supreme confidence of men who knew that even if they made a mistake, 2 other Mustangs were covering them. By contrast, German pilots flew alone even when in formation. There was no fuel for practice, no time for training, no margin for error. One mistake meant death, and everyone made mistakes eventually. The mathematics were inexorable. The strategic impact of the P-51 extended far beyond individual dogfights. By mid-1944, American bombers with Mustang escort were systematically destroying Germany's synthetic fuel production. The Luna facility, the Politz refineries, the Ruhland plants, one by one they were reduced to smoking rubble. Germany had always depended on synthetic fuel. The country had no domestic oil reserves. Coal liquefaction through the Fischer-Tropsch and Bergius processes provided aviation gasoline, but these massive industrial complexes required precise bombing to damage. Before Mustangs enabled deep penetration escort, the synthetic fuel plants were too far from England for effective attack. After March 1944, nothing was safe. Weber watched the fuel situation deteriorate from crisis to catastrophe. His squadron's allocation dropped from sufficient to marginal to desperate. By August 1944, JG-3 received enough fuel for 1 sortie per aircraft every 3 days. Training flights ceased entirely. New pilots arrived having never practiced formation flying, never fired their guns in flight, never experienced combat maneuvering. They learned in combat, and most died in their first or second mission. The cruelest aspect was that Germany was actually producing more fighters than ever. Albert Speer's dispersed manufacturing pushed output to over 3,000 aircraft monthly by late 1944. But they sat grounded on airfields, unfueled and often unflown, while American Mustangs roamed overhead, strafing at will. Weber personally witnessed 14 brand new FW-190s destroyed on the ground at Stendal in September 1944, burned by marauding P-51s before they'd flown a single combat mission. The psychological toll was crushing. Fighter pilots are aggressive by nature, trained to attack, to seize initiative, to dominate. Being forced into perpetual defense, knowing you're outnumbered, outfueled, and outranged, watching friends die daily for objectives that couldn't change the war's outcome, this ground men down to nothing. Weber saw it in the mirror every morning. Eyes that had once looked forward to combat now showed only exhausted resignation. By late 1944, suicide rates in fighter units were epidemic. One of Weber's pilots, Feldwebel Heinrich Stein, landed after a mission, climbed out of his cockpit, walked to the edge of the airfield, and shot himself without saying a word. Another, Lieutenant Peter Vogel, deliberately flew his damaged fighter into a mountainside rather than bail out. Weber understood. There were days he considered it himself. The only things that kept him flying were duty to the younger pilots who needed his experience and a stubborn refusal to let the Americans kill him. They could beat him. They couldn't make him quit. The appearance of jet fighters in late 1944 briefly lifted hopes. The Messerschmitt Me 262 was genuinely revolutionary, 100 miles per hour faster than a P-51D. Weber qualified on jets in October 1944 and flew 12 missions in the Schwalbe. It was simultaneously the most capable and most useless aircraft he'd ever flown. Capable because in level flight, nothing could catch it. Useless because Germany had no fuel to train pilots in its handling, no spare parts to maintain it, and no safe airfields from which to operate. Mustangs had solved the jet problem with brutal simplicity. They couldn't catch Me 262s in the air, so they waited at known jet bases and attacked during takeoff and landing, when jets were slow and vulnerable. Weber watched 7 of JG-3's precious jets destroyed this way in November alone. The experience taught him the fundamental lesson of the air war. Technology without fuel, without training, without supporting infrastructure was worthless. The Americans had built not just a better fighter but a better system for producing, maintaining, fueling, and employing fighters. That system was unstoppable. The final humiliation came in January 1945 with Operation Bodenplatte, the Luftwaffe's desperate New Year's Day surprise attack on Allied airfields in Belgium. Nearly every operational fighter in the West, including Weber's entire Geschwader, was committed to the strike. The mission achieved tactical surprise and destroyed over 300 Allied aircraft on the ground. It should have been a triumph. Instead, it was suicide. The Luftwaffe lost 271 aircraft and 213 pilots, including squadron commanders, group commanders, and wing commanders, the irreplaceable core of experience and leadership. Weber survived because his aircraft developed engine trouble and he aborted over the target. He landed to learn that JG-3 had lost 19 pilots including the Geschwader Commandeur. The Americans replaced their destroyed aircraft within a week. The Luftwaffe never recovered. After Bodenplatte, organized resistance became impossible. Sorties were flown when fuel permitted, which was rarely. Pilots operated individually or in pairs, attacking when opportunity presented and fleeing at the first sign of escorts. It wasn't combat. It was survival. Weber's last victory came on February 19, 1945. A straggling B-17 with one engine feathered, separated from its formation, limping home alone. Weber attacked from the bomber's blind spot, raked it with cannon fire, watched it roll over and begin its death spiral. As it fell, the crew bailed out. 10 young men floating down on parachutes, alive because Weber had allowed them to escape before the aircraft exploded. He could have killed them. Other pilots did. But Weber had no hatred left, only exhaustion and the knowledge that killing 10 men wouldn't change anything. As he turned for home, 6 P-51s appeared. Weber firewalled the throttle, dove for the deck, and used every trick of terrain masking and desperate maneuvering to escape. He made it back to base running on fumes, engine smoking, aircraft shot to pieces. It was victory number 28. It would be his last. By April 1945, JG-3 existed only in name. Of the 120 pilots Weber had served alongside since January 1944, 9 were still alive and operational. The rest were dead, crippled, or captured. Aircraft strength fluctuated between 0 and 10 depending on what could be scavenged from wrecks and what fuel could be stolen from other units. Missions were flown when ordered, but everyone knew they were gestures, theatrical performances for a regime that had already lost. Now, on April 11, 1945, Weber led 7 aircraft against 400 bombers and God knew how many escorts because orders were orders and surrender meant execution. His fuel would last 30 minutes. His ammunition load was half normal because the supply system had collapsed. His wingmen had fewer hours in a fighter than Weber had in the last month alone. The odds of survival were 0. The odds of affecting the war's outcome were less than 0. Yet Weber nosed his FW-190 over into attack position because that was what fighter pilots did. They fought until they couldn't. The bombers came into view, massive fortresses stacked in combat boxes stretching from horizon to horizon, their contrails writing America's dominance across the sky. Weber scanned for escorts, saw none, knew they were there regardless, waiting. He armed his weapons. Klaus's voice was high with fear. "Herr Oberleutnant, I don't see the escorts." "They'll come," Weber said quietly. "They always come. And they're always fuel-heavy with altitude to spare. Attack fast, aim true, and run for your life." The 7 German fighters dove on the bomber stream. Before they'd closed to firing range, the Mustangs appeared. Not a few. Dozens. Dropping from 35,000 feet with the sun behind them, silver aircraft moving with choreographed precision, cutting off every escape route before the attack began. Weber recognized the tactic. He'd seen it 100 times. These American pilots had fought this war long enough to know every German maneuver before it developed. He fired at AB-17, saw his shells impact, knew he'd done no critical damage. Then the Mustangs were among them. Klaus died first, aircraft disintegrating under converging fire from 3 directions. 2 more FW-190s exploded within seconds. Weber reversed hard, trying to scrub airspeed and force an overshoot. The Mustang pilot anticipated, adjusted, stayed locked behind him. Tracers walked up Weber's fuselage. His windscreen starred with bullet impacts. The engine began losing power, streaming black smoke. Oil pressure dropped to 0. He had seconds before catastrophic failure. Weber rolled inverted and pulled, diving nearly vertical toward the earth 30,000 feet below. The Mustang followed. At 15,000 feet, Weber's engine seized. The propeller froze, windmilling resistance slowing him rapidly. At 10,000 feet, he jettisoned the canopy. At 5,000 feet, he released his harness. At 2,000 feet, he kicked the stick forward and let the aircraft throw him out. The parachute opened with a crack. Weber floated down toward a country that had once been his home and was now simply wreckage. Above him, the American bombers continued east, untouched, unstoppable. The Mustangs circled like patient predators, waiting for any remaining German fighter to make the mistake of attacking. None did. Weber landed in a field outside Magdeburg and was captured by American troops within an hour. They were polite, professional, almost friendly. A young lieutenant who processed his surrender spoke German and asked about his service. When Weber mentioned JG-3, the American nodded with what seemed like respect. "You guys gave us hell in 43 and early 44, he said. "By 45, I honestly felt bad. You were fighting with nothing against everything. Brave, but pointless." Weber didn't argue. 3 years of transformation from elite warrior to exhausted survivor had burned away his capacity for pride or shame. He simply nodded. In the POW camp at Reims, Weber met other captured Luftwaffe pilots. They shared stories, compared notes, tried to process what had happened. The consensus emerged in conversations conducted in quiet corners away from guards. The P-51 had destroyed the Luftwaffe not through any single battle but through strategic suffocation. It enabled the systematic destruction of fuel production. It allowed precision bombing of aircraft factories. It hunted German fighters at their own bases. It escorted bombers to targets so deep that defending them required burning Germany's last fuel reserves. Most critically, it created a psychological collapse. German pilots knew that if they took off, they would face Mustangs. If they fought Mustangs, they would probably die. If they somehow survived, they'd return to find their airfield strafed and their friends dead. Day after day, mission after mission, the certainty of defeat ground men down until the Luftwaffe, once the world's most feared air force, simply ceased to function as a coherent fighting force. Weber was released from POW camp in June 1946. He returned to Salzwedel to find the base obliterated, the town heavily damaged, Germany divided and occupied. Of the 9 pilots from JG, 3 he'd known to survive, he could locate 4. The rest had vanished into the post-war chaos, likely dead from last-ditch fighting or simply lost in the refugees' streams. He tried civilian life. Worked construction. Then truck driving. Eventually found employment with Lufthansa as the airline rebuilt. By 1956, he was flying commercial routes across Europe, carrying tourists and businessmen in converted bombers over the same territory he'd fought above a decade earlier. In 1959, Weber was invited to a reunion of Allied and German fighter pilots in London. He almost didn't go. The shame of defeat, the memory of friends lost, the waste of it all, these were not things he wanted to revisit. But his wife, Anna, a nurse he'd married in 1947, insisted. "You survived," she said. "Honor that by living, not hiding." The reunion was strange, awkward at first. German pilots who'd spent 3 years trying to kill Americans now shook hands with the men who'd hunted them. American pilots whose friends had died over Germany sat across from the men who'd killed them. But something unexpected happened. In sharing their stories, both sides recognized they'd been pawns in a larger tragedy. The Americans respected the courage of men who'd continued fighting when defeat was certain. The Germans acknowledged the professionalism of enemies who'd granted mercy when they could have shown none. On the second night, Weber met Colonel James Mitchell, a former P-51 pilot with the 357th Fighter Group. Mitchell had flown the first Mustang escort mission to Berlin in March 1944. They compared notes, discovered they'd been in the same sky over Magdeburg on at least 3 occasions, might even have fought each other. Instead of rekindling hatred, the revelation forged connection. Both had survived the same war from opposite sides. Mitchell described the stress of long-range escort missions, the fear of being shot down deep in enemy territory, the guilt of surviving when friends didn't. Weber shared the desperation of defending with dwindling resources, the heartbreak of watching untrained boys sent to die, the slow realization that nothing he did mattered. "We were both trapped in something larger than ourselves," Mitchell said. "I'm grateful we survived it. I'm grateful we're not enemies anymore." That conversation changed Weber's understanding of his experience. He'd spent a decade viewing his war through the lens of defeat and waste. But Mitchell's perspective revealed something different. The Americans hadn't just won. They'd built a system so superior that German courage and skill were rendered irrelevant. That wasn't shameful. It was simply reality. And in the post-war world, Germany's former enemies had helped rebuild rather than destroy, had made Germany an ally rather than a vassal. The Mustangs that had hunted Weber across German skies had ultimately freed Germany from a regime that would have destroyed it completely. In 1961, Weber joined the reformed Luftwaffe of the Federal Republic of Germany, now a NATO member allied with the United States. He trained on F-86 Sabres and later F-104 Starfighters, flew alongside American pilots in joint exercises, defended the same Germany he'd once defended but now for genuinely democratic values rather than fascist ideology. The irony wasn't lost on him. In 1975, Weber attended an air show at Duxford in England featuring restored warbirds including a P-51 Mustang. Watching it fly, listening to the distinctive Merlin engine that had been the soundtrack of his defeat, he felt no bitterness. Only respect for the machine and the men who'd flown it. After the display, he approached the Mustang on static display. Ran his hand along the laminar flow wing. Examined the K-14 computing gunsight. Stood in the pilot's perspective and imagined diving on his FW-190 from altitude. A voice beside him said, "Beautiful aircraft, isn't she?" Weber turned to find an elderly man in an American Legion jacket. "Flew her in the war," the man continued. 68 missions. Scary, exhilarating, and over far too quickly. "Which group?" Weber asked. "The 4th, Debden." "You?" "JG-3. Salzwedel." The American's eyes widened slightly. "Your Luftwaffe." "Was," Weber said. "NATO now. We're on the same side." They stood in silence for a moment. Then the American extended his hand. "Gerald Cooper. Glad we're not shooting at each other anymore." Weber shook it. "Ernst Weber. So am I." They talked for an hour. Cooper described the fear and pride of long-range missions. Weber shared the desperation of defending with nothing. Both recognized the other's courage and professionalism. When they parted, Cooper said something Weber never forgot. "You guys made us earn every mile. But I'm glad the Mustang gave us the reach to end it." Every day the war continued, more people died. The P-51 shortened the war. That saved lives on both sides in the long run. Weber nodded. It was true. The sooner Germany lost, the fewer died pointlessly in a war already decided. The Mustang's dominance had been terrible for those who experienced it but merciful in its decisiveness. Weber retired from the Luftwaffe in 1979 with the rank of Oberst, having served NATO for 18 years. He lived quietly in Bavaria, flew gliders for recreation, gave occasional interviews to historians. He died in 1998 at age 80, surrounded by family, his life ultimately defined not by the 3 years he spent on the losing side of history but by the 50 years he spent building something better. Before he died, Weber wrote a memoir. The final chapter reflected on his experiences. "When I first saw P-51 Mustangs over Germany in January 1944, I thought I was witnessing the end of everything I'd fought for. I was right, but not in the way I understood then. The Mustangs did end the Luftwaffe. They ended Nazi Germany's capacity to resist. But in doing so, they ended a regime that would have consumed Germany completely. The shock of seeing American fighters where they couldn't be was the shock of reality confronting ideology. We'd been told American democracy was weak, that Jewish influence made them soft, that German will would triumph. Every belief proved false. The Americans built a better fighter, a better system, a better society. They projected power we couldn't match and used it to build a peace rather than simply winning a war. Looking back across 50 years, I'm grateful to have survived. Grateful for the chance to serve a democratic Germany allied with former enemies. Grateful that the Mustangs flying overhead in 1944 brought not just defeat but ultimately liberation. They shattered the Luftwaffe. But from those fragments, something better was built. That's the legacy of the P-51 over Germany. Not just victory, but the foundation for lasting peace. The P-51 Mustang entered service in 1942 as a good fighter. By 1944, it had become the strategic weapon that broke German air power. By war's end, it had claimed nearly 5,000 aerial victories and destroyed over 4,000 aircraft on the ground. But statistics don't capture impact. The Mustang enabled every strategic success of the American air campaign from mid-1944 forward. It escorted bombers that destroyed German industry. It hunted German fighters wherever they flew. It strafed airfields, trains, supply columns. It provided the air superiority umbrella under which Allied armies crossed Europe. Most importantly, it created hopelessness. German pilots who might have continued fighting with some chance of success simply gave up when they realized Mustangs could reach anywhere, anytime, with unlimited fuel and numerical superiority. The psychological collapse the P-51 induced was as important as its physical victories. Ernst Weber's story represents thousands of German pilots who experienced this transformation from confidence to defeat. But it also represents the possibility of redemption and reconciliation. The men who fought each other with lethal intent in 1944 and 1945 became allies and eventually friends in the decades that followed. The weapon that destroyed the Luftwaffe ultimately helped create the conditions for Germany's democratic rebirth. That's the deeper legacy of the P-51 over Germany. Not just how it won a war, but how that victory enabled a better peace. The wolf pack's last hunt ended not in mutual annihilation but in understanding that former enemies could become partners. The Mustangs that shocked Weber over Germany in 1944 ultimately freed him to build a better future. That shock, terrible as it was in the moment, proved merciful in the long perspective of history.